Are two-thirds of Americans living paycheck to paycheck? Is a proposed airline merger really a threat to competition? And why is the national debt a problem? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from inside the debt clock. There's a very rapid ticking sound in the background, but after a few tries and lots of soundproof padding, we were able to ensure top-notch audio quality for the very first episode of Econception. Here's the big point I want to get across today. The national debt is a problem. The national debt is big, but the national debt is not a problem because it is big. The national debt is $34 trillion and rising fast. $34 trillion is an impossible number to comprehend. The high end of scientists' estimate for the number of stars in this galaxy is 400 billion. That means that the number of dollars in the national debt is 85 times greater than the number of stars in the Milky Way. The national debt is about $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. It's about $260,000 per taxpayer. Not only is it large, the national debt is growing fast. The U.S. added the most recent trillion to the national debt in only 111 days. The deficit for 2023 was $2 trillion, and there are no signs of any significant reductions in deficits going forward. Now, it's easy to look at those numbers and be aghast. It's clearly unsustainable, people say. There's no way it can go on forever. To which Herbert Stein would say, exactly. Stein was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from 1972 to 1974, and he was an economist for the American Enterprise Institute for many years after that. He's most famous, though, for Stein's law. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Stein first made this point in a conversation about U.S. foreign debt. Other economists were expressing concern about how it couldn't keep going up forever. After listening to this for some time, Stein said with evident sarcasm, "Well, I recently came to the remarkable conclusion, which I commend to you, and that is that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop." Now, what Stein was saying is that if we all know that something cannot go on forever, we don't have to worry about it going on forever. We know it won't do that. People don't sit around and worry about whether gravity will stop working and stuff will just start floating around. We know it won't do that. That's just a fact about gravity. Similarly, it's a fact about U.S. debt that eventually, at some point, people will stop buying it on favorable terms. The bond market will eventually cut the Treasury off. That's a fact. It can't go on forever. It will stop. So, why is the debt actually a problem? Stein answers that question in a paper called Problems and Not Problems of the American Economy, which is from 1989. It's about the budget deficit, which Stein says is a problem, and the trade deficit, which he says is not a problem. Now, the portion about the trade deficit is excellent, but that's not the focus of today's episode. We'll do plenty on Econception about trade in future episodes. What's important for us today is Stein's explanation on why the budget deficit and the debt it accumulates is a problem. Stein wrote that the budget deficit is a problem because it demonstrates that the U.S. does not wisely allocate its national income. This is such a crucial point to understand. Think about it from a personal point of view. You have income that you make from your job. You spend that income on housing, food, insurance, entertainment, various other things. You have to make decisions about how you allocate your income. How much goes to housing? How much goes to food, etc. Now, there are better and worse ways to make those decisions. If you spent all of it on entertainment, That would be really dumb. But even though food is essential, if you spent all of your money on food, that would also be really dumb. There's a proper balance between all the different categories of spending in your life, and you're probably trying your best to get that balance right, with varying degrees of success, of course. You can add up all the incomes of all the individuals in a country to get the national income. The national income of the United States was about $27 trillion last year. Unlike with individuals, though, there's no single person making decisions about how to best spend the $27 trillion. This is a free country with free markets. Individuals make decisions on their own about how to spend their income, and they form corporations to make bigger decisions about investment and spending. Yet, within that ocean of individuals making their own decisions, there sits the federal government. The federal budget for 2023 was about $6 trillion. That's almost 1/4 of the national income, and it gets allocated by politicians. Stein wrote that we don't really think about spending in those terms. We often talk about the need to balance the budget and make sure that spending is paid for. That's important, but it's ultimately a secondary concern to the fundamental question. Is the government spending its portion of the national income sensibly? As Stein pointed out, people aren't really mad about the national income. The public is not saying that the problem is that the country's not rich enough, he wrote. It is saying that even though we are rich, we have too much crime, too much homelessness, too much illiteracy and ignorance, and so on. Think of it this way. What are the things that the government should do? Well, there's stuff that everyone agrees on, stuff like the military, law enforcement, courts, prisons, customs and border control, veterans benefits. There's stuff that most people agree on in some form, like education, some basic anti-poverty programs, unemployment insurance, transportation. And then there's all the administrative costs that come with running basic safety regulatory agencies, keeping the lights on, paying bureaucrats who do all this stuff, etc. The thing is, all of that combined is a minority of the federal budget. A majority of the federal budget, and a growing majority at that, goes to just 4 things: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest. The bulk of that spending, as Stein wrote, is from middle-class consumption. Most Social Security money goes to middle-class retirees. Most Medicare money goes to middle-class retirees. As Medicaid has been expanded through Obamacare and the pandemic into more of an entitlement program and less of an anti-poverty program, more of its spending is going to the middle class. And those 3 programs are driving the debt and requiring the borrowing that is turning interest into a major expense. The United States is a rich country mainly because of what was done in the past, Stein wrote. He continued, our performance today looks quite different. And remember, he's saying this in 1989. He says, our savings are low in relation to our national income, partly because the rate of private saving is low, and partly because the government deficit is large. As a consequence, the rate of private investment that is owned by Americans is very low. We have been fortunate that the rest of the world has been willing to supply capital to us. Capital owned by foreigners is better than no capital, but from the standpoint of the future incomes of Americans, capital owned by Americans is best. The true significance of the budget deficit is that it has substantially reduced the rate of private investment owned by Americans. That's the government crowding out private investment. When Stein wrote those words, the personal saving rate in the U.S. was 8.1%. The budget deficit was $153 billion. Today, the personal savings rate is only 3.4%, and last year the budget deficit was $2 trillion. So the trend he was describing has continued and accelerated. The huge chunk of the national income that politicians control, and that is supposed to primarily fund government functions that most people agree are necessary, is instead increasingly going to subsidize middle-class consumption, especially for retirees. Is this where we want the government to focus its spending? In a country where the military can't build the ships it needs, Public education fails to meet basic expectations of proficiency, infrastructure projects take forever and cost a fortune, and the war on poverty rages on after 6 decades? Stein really brings it home with his conclusion. He says, if the present allocation of the national output were the result of knowing and well-informed private and public choices, I would disagree with the outcome, but I would respect it. That is not the case, however. The present allocation of the national output is heavily influenced by governmental decisions that ignore the facts and the real issues. Decisions about the size of the deficit profoundly affect the share of the national output that is going to investment. The deficit decisions, however, do not consider that effect. They are only exercises in window dressing the figures to seem to comply with rules arbitrarily laid down several years ago. The share of the national output devoted to consumption is greatly affected by the level of taxation. In considering whether to raise taxes, however, we have no serious discussion of that or other real effects of taxation. The discussion is preempted by the question whether it is a good or bad to embarrass a president who made a firm commitment during the election campaign not to raise taxes. I could give many other examples of the failure to appreciate and act upon the real consequences of important decisions. This allocation will profoundly affect the quality of life in America, as well as our national security, for generations to come. It is not too strong to say, however, that we do not know what we are doing, or, if we know, we don't care. That's why the national debt is a problem. Not because it's big, but because it demonstrates that the basic questions of government budgeting are not being answered, or even attempted in any serious way, by the only people with the power to make better decisions. We hear it all the time from progressives. America is a big, evil, scary capitalist country where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. To illustrate this, they quote some kind of statistic from some kind of study that says that X% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. With a Democrat in the White House, now some Republicans are repeating this line. The most recent number seems to be that 62% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. There are several problems with this number. First, it just doesn't pass the smell test. The idea that in the richest country in the world, over half of people can't afford basic necessities is preposterous. Second, it's really hard to say what paycheck to paycheck actually means. If it means someone could not afford food if they missed one paycheck, that is a very different thing than saying that they could not afford to save for a vacation if they missed a paycheck. Human wants are infinite, and everybody could argue that they need a little more money for something. Even people making significant incomes might have to move some money around to pay for an unexpected expense. That doesn't mean they're on the verge of poverty. It means that they're facing an unexpected expense. The 62% number seems to have come from a survey from September of last year from the company Lending Tree. Living paycheck to paycheck remains the main financial lifestyle among U.S. consumers, the report said. Again, if whatever they're defining as paycheck to paycheck is also the main financial lifestyle, then it can't be too terrible, unless you seriously believe that a significant majority of Americans are poor or almost poor. Now, this also kind of makes sense on its own terms. You can live paycheck to paycheck no matter how big your paycheck is, if you also spend a ton of money. Someone with $1 million paycheck could live paycheck to paycheck if he also spent $1 million every 2 weeks. There are countless surveys from various firms that put out statistics about living paycheck to paycheck. Most of them are based on asking questions to a sample of respondents. Fortunately, as Matt Darling of the Niskanen Center frequently points out, we don't have to guess. We have very solid data on household finances from research conducted by the Federal Reserve that gives a much more accurate picture of how Americans are doing financially. Median family income in the United States is $70,000. That means half of families make more than $70,000 and half make less. It's also important to remember that age is a big factor here. Young people make less than older people since they have less experience and are in more junior positions within companies. If you look at families where the head of the household is between the ages of 45 and 54, the median income in the United States is $92,000. Now, 45 to 54 is generally the time in someone's life when they're making the most money. So the median American at the peak of his or her career currently makes almost six figures. That's the median. Again, half make more, half make less. But Americans have lots of debt, so maybe this doesn't matter, you might think. But we also know from the same data that the median American family has a net worth of $193,000. Again, that means half of families have net worths greater than $193,000 and half have net worths less than $193,000. And we also know that the median American family has $8,000 in checking accounts. Again, half have more, half have less, but the median is $8,000. That means there's no way that more than half are living paycheck to paycheck. By any definition of that term, that would be a cause for alarm. Someone with $8,000 in checking accounts is not someone in need of anti-poverty assistance. Now, if any of those numbers sound crazy high to you, remember that we're living in a very strange time where majorities of people believe that the economy is working well for them individually, but is terrible on the whole. This is in large part a function of politicians selling grievance narratives to win voters, and media emphasizing bad news to maximize clicks. People aren't actually as bad off as they might seem if you get your information primarily from politicians or the mainstream press. Debunking some of these myths will be a recurring theme on Econception going forward. Another myth from politicians is that corporate mergers are always bad. Now, they can be bad, and the U.S. has multiple government agencies that are tasked with protecting consumers from anti-competitive mergers. But companies aren't eternal beings that last forever. And that's one of the best things about the U.S. economy. As better companies find better ways to meet consumers' needs, they go out of business and are bought up by other companies so that their assets can be put to better use. We're seeing that cycle play out in the airline industry. Spirit Airlines started being an ultra-low-cost carrier in 1992. They had super low fares with extra charges for everything else. Spirit isn't for everyone, but for people who just want to fly for as cheap as possible, it's a great option to have available. But Spirit is in rough shape financially. It was looking for buyers. Another ultra-low-cost carrier, Frontier, made an offer. Spirit shareholders rejected Frontier's offer because they thought they could get more. Then JetBlue, a low-cost carrier, made a better offer. That offer turned into a deal that the shareholders of both companies approved in 2022. But the Department of Justice sued to block the merger, saying that it would be anti-competitive. This is part of a larger push by the Biden administration to rework U.S. merger laws to give the government more power to block mergers. In many cases, it represents a return to the big is bad mentality that characterized antitrust law before the 1970s. Since then, antitrust has been refocused on the consumer welfare standard, which says that blocking a merger should require the government to demonstrate that there will be harm to consumers if the merger goes through, rather than making political arguments about the right size a company should be. JetBlue's current market share, plus Spirit's current market share, will combine for 10% of the U.S. domestic air travel market. Nowhere near a monopoly, obviously. The U.S. domestic air travel market is dominated by American, United, Delta, and Southwest, each of which have about 15 to 18% of the total. All their other competitors are much smaller. A merged JetBlue and Spirit would stand a chance to compete against those four in a way that they could never do on their own. JetBlue's network is denser and centered on the East Coast, and Spirit's network is sparser but national. Combining the two would make them a more direct competitor to Southwest, which started as a low-fare carrier. But a federal judge blocked the merger anyway, siding with the Department of Justice's argument that it would be anti-competitive. Making matters worse, Spirit might go bankrupt regardless. If it were to go under, it's possible that its assets would get bought by one of the 4 major airlines, giving them an even more market share. At least with the merger, we know JetBlue would be the one to gain rather than the airlines that are already larger. Now, JetBlue and Spirit are appealing the judge's decision, so we don't know yet how it will shake out. We also don't know if the merger would be a good idea, if it ends up being permitted anyway. Maybe they'll merge and the plans to integrate the companies will fail, and the new larger company will go out of business in a few years. Or maybe it'll work so well that they end up buying Southwest in a few years. Who knows? Not me, not the government, which is why, in the absence of really solid evidence that a merger will hurt consumers, the government shouldn't get in the way of mergers just because it thinks companies of a certain size are problematic. Which leads us to the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. Now, the paper of the episode will be a recurring segment at the end of every Econception episode, where we highlight an economics paper that's worth knowing about. There are so many important papers that have shaped the discipline. The best ones have one key idea, and for that reason, they could be summarized in a few minutes at the end of a podcast. The very first one is one of my favorites. From the Journal of Political Economy in 1950 by Armin Elshin. The paper is called Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory. In this paper, Elshin applies the ideas of evolution and adaptation to the behavior of companies. He says that companies don't actually seek to maximize profits because they don't have to. All they have to do is make profits. Companies that make profits survive, and companies that don't make profits fail. This insight helps to better align economic theory with what businesses do in the real world. Businesses don't sit around trying to optimize equations to make the most profits humanly possible, and they can't predict the future. Everything is so uncertain that they couldn't even maximize profits if they wanted to. Instead, they try to do better than their competitors. The companies that make profits look like they maximized profits in hindsight, but in the moment they weren't trying to. It's a brilliant paper. It changed the way we look at firms. Armin Elshin, 1950, Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory. Read it. That's all for today. Remember that the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work. I'm Dominic Pino of National Review Institute. This has been Econception. Please join us next time.